Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nevena, and I'm the General Manager of the Information Rights Project. An absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight. For those of you who are new to us, we are the Information Rights Project, and we defend the people who tell the truth and pay for it. The whistleblowers, the journalists, the publishers, those who hold power to account and find themselves punished for doing it. Tonight is the third instalment of the Whistleblower Diaries. This is our series of direct conversations with the people living at the very sharp end of the truth, their own accounts in their own words. Our guest tonight is Antony Loewenstein, and Greg will introduce him properly in a moment. Leading the conversation this evening is Greg Barnes, SC. Greg is a barrister, a long-standing voice on civil liberties in this country, and is also the Deputy Chair of the Information Rights Project. He's the right man to draw this story out for us tonight. One thing worth mentioning, it is the last day of the financial year, as many people are aware, and our annual fundraiser closes this week on Julian Assange's birthday. Every donation, which is tax deductible for our Australian supporters, goes directly to the work you're here for, defending the people who take real risks to keep the public informed. If tonight reminds you of why that matters to you, there is a link that we'll be sharing that goes directly to our fundraiser. A few quick notes before we hand over. Greg and Antony will be speaking for the first part of the session, and then we'll open the floor to your questions after that. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function or the chat directly, and we'll endeavour to get to it. Greg, with that, we'll take it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nevena, and it's a great pleasure to be here on another of the Whistleblowers Diaries. Antony Loewenstein needs no introduction. He's an extraordinary figure in Australia, in my view. I've met him many years ago. I knew his dad, who was a barrister in Melbourne, and also a lovely guy who's been very progressive on a lot of these issues as well. But you all know Antony, you know his work. He's an Australian German independent award-winning filmmaker and investigative journalist, author. Reminds me a bit, Antony, you remind me a bit of Seymour Hersh, which is a great compliment. Yeah, because I was watching, there's a great doco out on Seymour Hersh that was on Netflix.
It's fantastic.
That I saw, and I thought of you.
Oh, it's a great film. Yeah.
Yeah, and Anthony's worked in dozens of countries around the world. He's taken a particular interest in Israel and the Palestinian issue, author of a number of books, and let me say, has taken enormous heat, to put it mildly, for taking the stance that he's done in his own community, but it's to his great credit. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to have a chat with Antony, got some issues that we want to explore, and then I think after about 35 minutes or so, we're going to open it up for questions. Antony, firstly, welcome, and can I just start on asking you about the Palestine Laboratory and the arms trade issue. The Palestine Laboratory argues that the occupied territories function as a testing ground for weapons and surveillance technology that Israel then exports worldwide. How does that actually work, that system?
Let me first start off by thanking the Information Rights Project for having me. I'm really honoured. I've been a really keen supporter of this organisation, not least because it supported, well, I guess before it existed, Julian Assange, but certainly more recently people like David McBride, who I've known for a long time before he was in prison, and shamefully is still in prison. Hopefully he gets released soon. He certainly should not be there. The Palestine Laboratory, in short, was a book I released in May 2023, so before October 7, but it certainly has become, I would say, far more, not that it wasn't relevant before, but quite prescient as it turns out. So what does it practically mean? So what I show through documentary evidence, through on-the-ground reporting in Israel, the West Bank and Gaza over many years, is how Israel realised a long time ago that many of its actions weren't necessarily particularly popular. I'm not talking about within Israel, I'm talking about globally. This is before 1967 when Israel took control of the West Bank and Gaza. And there are many countries who, at least publicly, said they opposed what Israel was doing. They should end the occupation. They should give the West Bank and Gaza back. And to counter that, putting aside the huge amounts of money on propaganda which they're spending, but in terms of the actual occupation itself, they have spent now roughly 60 odd years, since 1967, to develop huge amounts of technologies and tools and surveillance and weapons to, inverted commas, manage Palestinians, control Palestinians, to essentially find a way to deal with a population in the West Bank and Gaza, which is roughly 5 million people, 2 million in Gaza and roughly 3 million in the West Bank, who don't want to be under occupation. So what does that mean practically in the modern era? Briefly, surveillance technology, killer drones, facial recognition technology, spyware, a range of other tools. And Israel then shows or displays that technology, those tools, to foreign markets at global arms fairs, privately between ministers, prime ministers, presidents. And just recently, about 2 weeks ago, we got the latest figures for the Israeli arms industry from 2025. It was 19.2 billion US dollars, the biggest by far. The year before then, it was about 5 billion less. The industry on the one hand is booming. And where is that, where are all the weapons going? First purchaser, the biggest, was Europe. Europe is obsessed with Israeli spyware and weapons. Arab countries, Asian countries, huge amounts of nations. And finally, I often argue in the book, and I did a film about it also for Al Jazeera that people can watch that came out last year, which was really to say that the arms industry is partly about making money. Obviously, money is a key driver of the arms industry. In 2025, the global arms industry, Greg, was worth about $2.5 trillion. Not just Israel, of course, but globally. Israel is about 7th in the world. Never going to be number one. The US is number one, and Israel's never going to overtake the US for a range of reasons. Israel's a country of 10 million people. It's a relatively small place. But obviously it punches well above its weight because of its the fact there's an occupation on its doorstep. But the Palestine Laboratory is not just about making money. It's also an ideological project. And what I say in the book and the film is that in countries like, say, India, which is one of the biggest purchasers of Israeli spyware and weapons, it's also an alliance of ethno-nationalism, a belief that they admire each other's racism. In Israel, racism against Palestinians, and in India under Prime Minister Modi against Muslims. So the laboratory operates in many different levels, and I think there are cracks in the armor, but it is still unbelievably successful.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in terms of that global dispersal of weaponry. I think you refer to the fact that the Myanmar military,
Yes.
one of the most odious in the world,
Yes.
has been purchasing weapons from Israel. A lot of these regimes are equally odious, but.
And so can I say on that Myanmar, after Myanmar was found to have committed genocide by the UN.
Yeah.
Not that they were a great
right.
regime. I mean, they weren't a great regime before then, let's be clear. But yes,
Yeah.
In other words, there's no hesitation selling spyware or armaments to a regime, as you say. The Myanmar junta are one of the most repressive on the planet. Yes,
Yeah.
to this day.
Can I ask Anthony on this, because this is a question that's been pursued by Senator David Sherbridge and others. The engagement of Australia and Australian companies with Israeli companies. So, for example, companies will say, "Well, no, we don't make military exports we don't export them to Israel. But what they are doing is making components." Is that right? And also software, for example.
Absolutely. So one of the things that's been quite infuriating is watching so many in the media, and also, frankly, the Albanese government just blatantly lie about this, or in the media's case, not reporting it. So I'm the co-founder and co-editor of Declassified Australia, which launched about 5 years ago with Peter Cronau, who used to be with Four Corners and now is a freelance journalist like me. And he broke a lot of these stories along with Kelly Tranter, who's a lawyer that you would know here in New South Wales. And in short, Australia for years, before October 7 and definitely since, has continued to sell and provide weapons parts for the F-35 fighter jet that Israel's been using over Gaza. Now, when the government has been asked about this, Albanese, Penny Wong, Richard Marles and others, they all say the same thing. we haven't sold weapons to Israel for 5 or so years, and therefore we're doing nothing wrong. But then when Wong was asked a bit more, I think either by Shoebridge or I forget someone else in the last year or so, said, well, we sell non-lethal parts to a plane. They were her words. To be clear, there are various parts that the Australian companies are making, including, for example, the bomb bay door that is attached to a plane that opens, a bomb falls from that plane, which has caused absolute carnage in Gaza. I mean, it's so obvious what's been going on for close to 3 years. There's been 70 to 100,000 Palestinians killed, if not more, the vast majority of whom are civilians. So we have in Declassified shown through evidence and documents and leaks that the parts of A continued and often deepened as Israel's genocide has got worse after October 7. And secondly, some of those spare parts are not only being flown on military planes, but commercial planes. So the last expose we did about 6 or so months ago was Thai Airlines flying from Sydney to Bangkok to Tel Aviv. It goes Thai Airways from Sydney to Bangkok, and then El Al, the Israeli airline, from Bangkok to Tel Aviv. Now, these parts are not explosives. They're not going to blow up and kill people on their own. But there is a clear knowledge by Thai Airways, and we presume other airlines, who are putting these parts on their planes, which then get put into a Lockheed Martin global supply chain. And these planes are used by Israel and the US and others. And when Richard Marles is asked about this, assuming he ever is, he says, well, we're just part of the Lockheed Martin global supply chain, nothing to see here, as opposed to saying, hang on a minute, there are serious legal culpabilities, let alone the moral question, of the Australian government not just okaying but encouraging Australian companies to A, make money, yes, but to use these components in a plane, which we know is causing carnage over Gaza and beyond. So yes, you'll be shocked to know, Greg, the government continues to lie about this. And most of the media, by the way, is asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, that's right.
With some exceptions. Totally asleep at the wheel.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Just shifting a little bit, you've described surveillance as a growth industry. And you know, Palestine Laboratory is in part about, you know, the growth of surveillance technology. Where do you see this heading? Because there's now this, of course, you know, as Eisenhower rightly said, the military-industrial complex. You've got Silicon Valley and military surveillance. Where's that going to take us, do you think, in terms of surveillance of the broader community?
Well, nowhere good. Your people will be shocked to know. Look, I think there's a few things happening that are disturbing and worth saying. I'll be brief. One, yes, I talk in the book about the Palestine Laboratory, which is mostly Israeli companies which are testing surveillance tech and weapons on Palestinians, which they then sell around the world, including in Gaza, the West Bank, and elsewhere. But what's happened in the last, particularly 5 years, but especially since October 7, is many of the biggest Silicon Valley companies, Amazon, Google, Palantir, and others, Microsoft, have been providing cloud services to Israel. Now, some of these existed before October 7, but Israel was so desperate for more cloud space after October 7 that all these companies were desperate to help. I mean, obviously Israel was paying them, but the contracts were not that huge. So these big tech companies were actually using Palestine themselves, I would argue, as a laboratory. Because those companies are not just doing it in that case for money. The Israeli contracts were not that huge. We're not talking about billions and billions of dollars. Israel's a small country. So they wanted to use Palestine as a model for where this could potentially go. So you can be rest assured that other nations in years to come who want to fight their own inhumane wars, go after their own unwanted minorities, will be using the same tools and the same software and the same companies, many of whom didn't just sell the technology, but actually had their own people going to Israel since October 7. Another growth area that I've been seeing in the last few years is election interference. Now, clearly, since Trump became president in 2016, much of the Western corporate press has been obsessed with Russia and China. And I'm not denying that those countries don't meddle. They do. There is evidence that they do, as does Iran. But what is largely left unsaid is that Israel is as much of a player in this game as anybody else. And I think so often the media coverage about this is, let's focus on our official enemies. And again, I'm not dismissing or ignoring what Putin or Xi are doing. They are involved and there's meddling. It exists in Australia and elsewhere. But one thing that I'm seeing a lot of evidence of, and this is not surveillance in the traditional sense, but there's lots of evidence in the last years that Israeli companies have become guns for hire. So government X around the world or opposition party Y will go to an Israeli company and say, can you help us try to win an election? Now, sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. How do they do that? Creating huge amounts of bots, fake websites, creating lies and disinformation about candidates. It's usually directed at those on the left, although not particularly. There's an example in the last few months of Israeli companies who are involved in trying to play with candidates in French local elections. We're not even talking about an election. There's obviously an election next year, that a major French election. This is like a local French election. So I see that side of it growing hugely, and I can see why a lot of countries and parties would find that unbelievably attractive, not just in dictatorships, but also in democracies. So I see that as a huge growth area. There's increasing evidence that Israel, not solely Israel, but Israel amongst others, is involved in surveillance on smart cars. So obviously increasing, there's huge amounts of computer technology in cars that we buy, not just Teslas, but others. There's a lot of evidence that Israel and its companies are able to listen to conversations that people are having in their cars and record those. There is increasingly what you also find is what a lot of the beginning of my reporting on this Palestine Laboratory was about Pegasus. People will remember the spyware that people can put on your phone to target all your information. And that still continues. There's huge amounts of companies that are doing that. But it's becoming so sophisticated, there's actually no way to really tell if your phone has been targeted. It used to be a situation where it required a random text message. You clicked on this message and went nowhere, you forgot about it and your phone was infected. Now it's something called zero click. So there's no way to actually know, without checking, if your phone has been captured. And that doesn't mean, I'm sure people on this call will know this, but whether you have encrypted apps, Signal or WhatsApp, makes no difference. If your phone is compromised, those apps are totally irrelevant. Useless, in other words. And so I really see a growth area in those industries because there are so many countries that want it, police services, intelligence services, and there's no regulation. The EU a few years ago kind of flirted with some kind of regulation, didn't go anywhere. Why? Because no one wants to do it. Everyone wants to get access to these tools, including, by the way, Australia, which does use various levels of government. Whether it's, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't actually matter that much who actually is in charge in Canberra. I mean, whether one nation gets in maybe is a more complicated picture, but whether it's Labor or Liberal, their view actually is remarkably similar towards these technologies. They want to use it.
Yeah. No, just move on to Germany, because in your documentary, Germany's Israel Obsession, you looked at, Germany's commitment to never again and how that has become, it's really hardened into a McCarthyist type culture when it comes to criticising Israel. Just talk us through that.
So just a brief background. I'm obviously an Australian citizen, but I'm also a German citizen. I have a German passport, and that's relevant only because I was interested in understanding I was having contacts and colleagues in Germany saying to me before October 7, but way worse since, that it's probably one of the most repressive Western states in relation to free speech on Israel. What does that mean practically? It goes without saying, but obviously after the end of the Holocaust, and Israel was born in 1948, one of the most controversial decisions that Israel took in the 50s was to make friends with West Germany, essentially. It was decided they should take the money. It was seen as blood money. And that relationship was a way for Germany, so it thought, to cleanse its guilt. Germany had killed 6 million odd Jews, along with obviously millions and millions of others. And they were looking for global, guilt washing, essentially. Yeah. And they found that with their relationship with Israel. And over decades that developed and developed until when Angela Merkel was Chancellor, she gave a very famous speech, which essentially she said, this is German, but I'm translating, a reason of state of the German state is to support and be a friend of the closest friend possible of Israel, regardless of what it does. Now, yes, Germany does sometimes criticize settlements in Palestine, yes. But what this has meant practically, Greg, particularly since October 7, is an unbelievably brutal crackdown on free speech. People go to a protest, Jewish, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, Christian, whatever you may be, atheist, and say things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which of course is familiar to people who live in Australia, where this is increasingly being outlawed as well. And you can be arrested and charged. There is massive police violence, and I saw that with my own eyes, it's in the movie, against peaceful protest. Not radical elements trying to cause violence, like literally people protesting, saying free Palestine in the war in Gaza, whatever it may be. Police, I have not seen in a Western state, and I'm well aware there's massive police violence in Australia and the UK and the US. I'm well aware of that. But in Germany, against pro-Palestine activists, protesters, it was really extreme. There is almost like an omerta amongst many in the German media and political space to really believe that they, as Germans, have a moral responsibility to say nothing critical. And that is the way they want to wash their guilt. Of course, what that's leading to is probably now the most popular party there is the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. It's not in government, but it's polling 25-30%. There's a decent chance in years to come, it's already doing quite well in various German states, it'll also do very well federally in Berlin. And the impact of that has been that they, as the most, with a history, by the way, as people will know, of associating with neo-Nazis, with racism, they're on the far right. For them, being blind supporters of Israel is a way to almost sort of wash their own awful past. And they say, hang on a minute, you can't criticize us. We love Israel. And I see exactly the same thing happening, by the way, with parts of the Republicans in the US. I see it happening here with One Nation, Pauline Hanson and others, where these are groups and parties which traditionally have been often hostile to Jews or certainly not friendly, who see blindly supporting Israel as a way, and of course when I say supporting Israel, supporting Netanyahu, supporting the most extreme policies in Gaza, the West Bank and beyond, and using that policy as getting out of jail free card. And what disturbed me about that in Germany was that we're seeing now, obviously, as people know, in country after country after country, that Palestine has become the litmus test. There are obviously other issues where people are in prison. Just in the last week, people will know in the US, there were, I think it was 7 or 8 Americans who were sentenced to jail, some of them for 50, 60, 70, 80 years for terrorism offences, so-called terrorism offences, who did not commit terrorism. And so clearly the Trump administration is cracking down on civil liberties, no shit, as we all know. But this is not just happening in Trump's America, it's happening in Germany, the biggest, most powerful country in Europe. And it's getting worse, not better.
Yeah, and the UK, we're seeing 80-year-olds arrested. We saw people go to jail for 5-6 years for alleged terrorism offences last week in the courts. I mean,
it's crazy.
Just to come back to that though, I mean, the word McCarthyism we bandy around a lot, but I think that you've got I think a Jewish philosopher in the doco who talks about the fact that this is a form of McCarthyism in Germany.
Look, you're right. McCarthyism is used extensively, as is Orwellian, but at the same time, they're also very useful words, and they're also true.
Absolutely.
And I think it's almost like the question that often gets asked in Germany, or for that matter in the UK or the US or Australia, is what is being done in the service of blindly supporting even if you don't accept as genocide in Gaza, which I think it is, but let's say a conflict, a war, brutality, whatever you want to call it, what is being done in the service of that? Are we willing, and clearly many elites and media figures are, willing to essentially give up our liberties to protect and support a different country? We're not even talking in Germany about criticizing the German state. You can say in Germany, Germany shouldn't exist. Germany hasn't got the right to exist. It doesn't exist. I hate Germany. If you think that, if you say that about Israel, which to be clear
Yeah.
is a different country, or in, as you say, in the UK, where people are being charged with terrorism for having signs that say "I support Palestine Action," the banned group that, as you said last week or the week before, the British courts in a shameful decision
Mm.
accepted was a terrorist organization akin to ISIS, Al Qaeda, neo-Nazi groups. Just absolutely bonkers. And I fear Australia is going in a similar direction, frankly.
Well, let's move on to that because we'll talk about Australia and we've seen the criminalisation of words in Queensland, of course, from the river to
Yes.
the sea, etc.
Yes.
That is currently or will be challenged in the High Court. The hate speech laws that I've been involved in. What are you seeing, and certainly through Declassified Australia, what are you picking up in terms of the trend on this issue? Because what um, I'm disturbed about, and I think a lot of people would be, Anthony, is, and I've seen it in the law before, you take a set of circumstances and then you say, oh, well, we've got it over here as well. So let's start banning forestry protesters, etc.
Yes,
Is that
absolutely.
you think that's something
Well,
that
I think it
is
doesn't stop
emerging?
with Palestine. It doesn't
Yeah.
stop with Palestine. That's why I said before, Greg, I think Palestine's a litmus test, but it doesn't stop there. I mean, clearly, some of the interest that elements of the British elite had in relation to Palestine, some of those same figures really started cracking down on protests in support of action on climate change. It's not just about Palestine. Yes, Palestine action is related to Israel-Palestine, but it's not just that issue, clearly. I mean, what do I see and fear? I see two things, and I should caveat what I'm saying with one important fact, because I think that if there's any silver lining, it's this. There was a Pew poll that came out the last week or so. It polled about
Mm.
35, 36 countries around the world about their views on Israel and Netanyahu. And in virtually every country, and Australia had one of the highest rates of negative feelings towards Israel and Netanyahu. Now, you don't, that first, that wasn't reported anywhere. Surprise, surprise. But secondly, what does that tell you? It tells you that there is, for a range of reasons, people have been seeing on their phones for close to 3 years, the utter destruction in Gaza. Now, why do I mention that in the context of this? What I'm saying is there is a profound disconnect. The law and political elites and in the Murdoch press and other media figures seem determined to put very, very strict boundaries on so-called acceptable speech on this issue. Firstly, I think it's not working. B, I see it as desperation, not strength. It's weakness. It's not. This is not a position of strength. Now, does that help someone in Brisbane who might potentially go to jail for years? No, it doesn't. I mean, if that person, which would be crazy, go to jail for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is just absurd. And I do hope the courts find that is unconstitutional, and you would know more whether that's going to happen. I certainly hope they do, but like we
I
saw with
think
the
it's quite a good case. Let's put it that way.
yeah, so he's hoping it happens that way, right? I guess the government could appeal, but let's see where that plays out. And I guess what I fear is that there is a growing desire by many on both major sides of politics. Let's be clear, in the UK, the Palestine Action thing happened not with the Tory government, with the Labor government.
Labor government. Yeah.
A Keir Starmer, RIP, not dead, but no longer, no longer Prime Minister, not for much longer, who used to be apparently a celebrated human rights lawyer, but his record, not least on the Assange case, is very troubling, which we can talk
Shocking.
about some other time. But the idea that it was Labor that pushed that, it wasn't the Tories. I mean, Tories supported it. Reform supported it too in the UK. So I guess what I see is a increasing crackdown on the acceptable forms of public protest. We saw just a few months ago here in Sydney when Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, came, the police acted, and I was there. It's complete thugs. They have the
Yeah.
state and, frankly, most of the media behind them to support them. I know most of those laws, thankfully, have been found to be
Well,
unconstitutional.
yeah, the New South Wales Supreme Court has done what courts should, which is to push back against the Minns
Indeed.
government.
But it seems to me pretty likely in years to come, Greg, and if not in months to come, that various other issues that animate people, whether it's climate,
Yeah.
Palestine, data centers, which is an increasing political issue, in fact, in many, many other countries around the world, including here, these big tech data centers which actually have become, in many weird ways, one of the key issues in many electoral battles in the US about these huge data centers sucking up massive amounts of water to sustain ChatGPT or Claude, whatever it may be. There are growing public protests against that, and there's a lot of moves in the US by those companies to try to force governments to crack down on those protests. So in other words, it starts with Palestine, it does not end there. And that's why it's so important for people to push back on that and not to accept this, which I think most of Australians do not.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Can we just talk a little bit about, well, firstly, declassified Australia, which has been a great addition to the landscape in this country. I mean, one of the issues has been the mainstream press has failed to pick up a lot of these issues, and the sheer and utter bias when it comes to, and palpable bias when it comes to Israel. How do you see the landscape in Australia now? I mean, there's your work, there's Michael West, Crikey, etc. What do you see the landscape as looking like going forward?
The legacy media, when I say that, I say the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, the Australian, I'd say the Murdoch tabloids, I'd say parts of the ABC. ABC is a big beast, so it's hard to generalise. They are the legacy media in a way. I think what is happening here is happening all over the world, which is a complete balkanisation of information, of media, where people go for their information. And on one level, that's wholly unsurprising, and I welcome that, because I started as a journalist 25 odd years ago as internet online news was surging, and clearly it's still, it is surging still in a way, but the impact of that practically is that the business model for really most journalism is still totally not working. It just doesn't work. Yes, the Sydney Morning Herald is not going to die tomorrow, but it's pretty clear where those papers are all going. They are chasing what they see as the aging audience. You have no one really under the age of 40 to 50 who reads those papers. Now, are they likely to suddenly embrace them as they get older? It's possible, but I'm not too optimistic about that. I mean, to me, as I've said for a long time, the only way that the media environment changes is people support it with money. And what worries me deeply is that for many people, or most people who cannot afford to buy, pay for, subscribe to, inverted commas, quality media, they get the slop. Either literal slop put out by the Murdoch press, or AI slop, which increasingly is what is in our media anyway. So therefore, what worries me is that leads to no accepted facts anywhere. And that's already a key problem. Now, I think people often who talk about that idealise some golden era back in the day. People say, everyone could agree on facts 50 years ago. Sorry, who's everybody? Firstly, most people didn't get access to the media. Most people who weren't white couldn't even be seen on TV. Right. So, let's put that into perspective. But having said that, there is a real problem, as we know. Everyone's in their silos. People are reading stuff that they agree with the whole time. And one thing I often say to people as a journalist when I teach younger journalists is you should spend, and I think it's relevant to everybody, we should be spending a lot of our time reading stuff we fundamentally disagree with. Now, I'm not saying that you want to read rabid neo-Nazi material. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying material that might challenge your ideas, challenge your beliefs, gives you different information. In other words, if one has the time, and most people don't, I guess, to engage information that is not agreeing with what you think. Challenge your own biases. Now, we all have biases on lots of issues. I have certain beliefs that, of course, I think I'm right. We all think that we're right on lots of things. So I see independent media, which is happening all over the world, is growing. The demand for it is growing. The outlets are growing. I do, as you say, very much support, obviously, Declassified Australia, Michael West, Crikey, my own work. There are various other independent journalists. There's Deep Cut in Australia. There's Media, there's Lamestream, there's many outlets doing interesting work. And to me, I say to people, if you can afford to support that, support it. It only succeeds with your money. Now, if you can't afford it, of course, that's fine. And I think on many issues, I see a real acceleration of this trend because of Gaza. There's no question in the last 3 years, nearly 3 years now, There's lots of other issues in the world. I'm not saying everything's about Israel-Palestine. It's not. But there's no doubt that in many places, some of the outlets I just mentioned, not all of them, like Michael West has been around for a while, many of them didn't exist before October 7. And they don't just cover Israel-Palestine, but there has been such an awakening of so many people in Australia and around the world who are totally fed up with the shit that they're being fed by the mainstream press, the voices they're not hearing, the idea that it's somehow complicated when it's talking about Israel-Palestine, but very not complicated when it talks about Russia, Ukraine, the language, the headline choices. And again, Russia is doing horrible things in Ukraine, but it's pretty clear how much of the media sees that in a very binary way. Whereas we're told, as we're seeing a lot now in this Royal Commission happening here in Australia around supposedly about anti-Semitism, although I think it's more, I fear, turning into a way to curtail legitimate free speech around Palestine and Israel. That's what I fear it's going. That I don't think it's going to work, Greg. I just don't think people are going to accept it. I'm not saying everyone's going to suddenly be thrown in jail, but I just don't think people will accept that curtailing of their free speach. I just don't think.
Well, I think, I mean, certainly universities. I've acted for 2 or 3 students who they tried to expel from universities, and if you want to champion civil disobedience, if governments want to champion civil disobedience, champion it. This is the way to do it. Tell people what they can't say. Anthony, we move on to questions.
Yes.
Now, Neville, how are we going to do this? You're going to ask the questions, righto?
I've got them here. So we've got quite a number have been coming in, but if you've got one that you'd like to direct to Antony or Greg, please feel free to share it in the Q&A or the chat section. The first one we have from Rodney, which asks, Antony, you've been disinvited, smeared and pushed to the margins for things you've said and written. What has speaking freely actually cost you? And would you advise a younger journalist to take the same risks today?
Great question.
Yeah, thank you, Rodney, for that question. I mean, I should preface my answer, and I'll keep it brief, is that I don't want to compare myself to people who have been thrown in jail, who have been physically attacked, who are, when I say whistleblowers, who actually are in jail. I've been smeared for years, yes. I have been attacked and bullied online, And I guess over time you grow a thick skin. I mean, the advice I often give to younger journalists is, if you want to write or engage on certain issues, whether it's about war on terror or Israel-Palestine or even abortion, issues which are, inverted commas, controversial, grow a thick skin. I mean, that's often the advice I give to people. Grow a thick skin. You will be attacked and mocked. Do I think it's worth it? Absolutely. One thing I would say, and as Greg was saying at the beginning, I've worked on lots of issues over the years, not just Israel-Palestine, the war on drugs and disaster capitalism, the war in Afghanistan, other issues. But the issue of Israel-Palestine, I feel in a way that I've hopefully played a small part in both trying to shift opinion in parts of the Jewish community, which has a long way to go, to be clear, and the wider community on this question. There are many, many others. I'm not for a second trying to paint myself as a hero, but to be a part of a growing numbers of people who are trying to make people aware long before October 7 and certainly since. And in some ways it's easier to do that now because people have been seeing on their devices for years, which was not as possible before, because Palestinian journalists in Gaza are showing us, the ones who haven't been murdered by Israel, what is going on. What is happening to them day after day after day with no end in sight? And the ultimate Israeli goal, frankly, remains kicking them all out of Gaza and the West Bank. Yep. That is the ultimate goal, has not changed. So the advice I give to young journalists is, it's a hard industry. It's worth entering. If you need to work for a mainstream news organisation to get your foot in the door, so be it. I wouldn't recommend working for Rupert Murdoch or Lachlan, but that's just me. But go independent if you can. Probably you need to do another job as well, along with independent journalism. And the best thing is just to get experience. Write stories, whether it's writing or podcasting or film, whatever it may be, just to get that experience. Because that's what matters in the end, actually, to get that experience and find your voice. It takes time to find your voice and be confident of that voice when you inevitably will be attacked and smeared and hated by some, but finally by... one thing I'd say, on my website I have a section called Letters, which only has hate mail. Only hate mail. And years ago, I remember it was Norman Finkelstein, the Jewish American writer, who had on his website a similar thing. He said, I get lots of people who write to me saying we think you're great. Okay, I'm not going to post that, but I'm going to post all the shit that I get so people can see. Now, I post not all of it, but some of it, as a way for people to say, this is what you're going to get. You get smeared, they call it a Nazi. I mean, everything. I mean, I'm a fucking Jew and they're calling me a Nazi anyway. It's bonkers. But I guess I have a thick skin. Doesn't mean I don't get hurt or upset. I mean, I'm human. Of course I do. But yeah, I'd say find your voice, and it takes time. But definitely I would say it's worth... We need independent journalists and voices more than ever.
It's Anthony.
Greg, we'll direct this one to both you and Antony. David asked, would you give us your feedback and observation of the Royal Commission? Greg, we'll start with you.
Well, it's a Royal Commission and I'm a lawyer, so I'm somewhat circumspect, but I'll say this. I have the same fear that Antony does. I think there's a clear agenda in this country to severely regulate and censor speech when it comes to Israel. We've seen it with the adoption by the APRA, the Health Professions Regulator, of the AHRA definition. Just an extraordinary decision and unbelievably incentive to those members who are Palestinian or Arab Australians, etc., leaving aside the rest of us. So I think it was a panicked decision. I'm certain it wasn't needed. I mean, it's sort of ironic that Albanese, arrogantly said to a group of women about women dying of, victims of violence, domestic violence, oh, well, what do you want a Royal Commission for? It's just for lawyers. And here he is, I think, panicked into setting one up. I don't... we'll see, but I think it's going to be a difficult exercise for those of us who are on the other side.
I'll just give it a brief answer. I'm not a lawyer, so I have no hesitation being maybe more critical. I'm not going to defame the Commissioner or others, but I'm clever enough not to do that. But I am also really worried about, do I think there was a need for a Royal Commission after the Bondi terror attack about the terror attack? Quite possibly. I mean, it was a horrible attack. It was the worst terrorist attack, certainly for decades, if not ever. There are lots of questions that we all have. How did this happen? How do these guys get guns? There's a million questions. I would like to know that, and you hope that that would assist in reducing the chances of it happening again. That, of course, is not what the Royal Commission is about. And as Greg rightly says, I think the Albanese government was forced into it, pushed into it at the end by a media campaign, well, not just the Murdoch press, but others, as a way, I think, to, and it's pretty clear, both in the pressure to establish it and since, that the most senior, most belligerent, and in my view, racist elements of the pro-Israel lobby are really directing so much of what is going on. Now, what I mean by that is, have there been witnesses giving disturbing evidence? For sure. No one can deny that there has been anti-Semitism and incidents and attacks, I mean, putting aside the Bondi attack. And that's vile and unacceptable. No question about that. But what has happened, in my view, for many of the witnesses is they have their feelings hurt. So there's one case, I remember a few months ago, where a woman said that she had to ride up in an elevator to work, and she saw ABC News on the elevator TV, which often a lot of workplaces have, and she saw some coverage about Israel-Palestine. She felt unsafe. You're thinking, hang on a minute. You feel unsafe about seeing a news story on ABC about Gaza? And by the way, we're about to see in the coming weeks SBS and ABC giving evidence / being God knows what interrogated. Now, those media outlets should be scrutinised. I'm not saying they're public money. Go for it. But I worry that the aim of it by the key people who pushed it is not actually to end or try to reduce anti-Semitism. It's to massively curtail legitimate speech, and secondly, to define what anti-Semitism is, which has always been, frankly, close to impossible to do so, but certainly in the modern era, it regularly is, by the pro-Israel lobby, serious criticism of Israel, or even saying Israel has no right to exist. No state has a right to exist. I don't think Israeli Jews shouldn't be alive. They have the right to survival and they have a right to safety. Of course they do. But the idea that we are being told by witness after witness after witness, which is not, by the way, being interrogated at all or very well by the lawyers at the Royal Commission, which worries me deeply. Are they incompetent or ignorant? I don't know. So I have a few concerns. I could be wrong. I might get to December and think, wow, she's done an amazing job. I'm happy to stand corrected, but not too optimistic about that.
Thanks, Anthony.
We might have to come back in December and see what your assessment is then. We have a question from Jan who asks, Gina Reinhardt made a speech in Townsville last Friday at a Pauline Hanson event. She'd said she'd like Australia to give Israel free land west of TVL for Israel to manufacture their weapons and drones.
Yeah.
It sounds crazy, but what do you think this was all about, Antony?
Yes, well, I'm glad that was brought up because barely any of the media reported it, which seems like a pretty big issue for the richest person in the country to advocate both giving free land to Israel to develop, she said, drones and the Iron Dome, which is their kind of missile defense shield that they have above their country, and secondly, to give free land to Elon Musk, who she's given, I think, or bought $1 billion of shares in SpaceX. I mean, I am very curious where this comes from. I don't know Gina Reinhardt personally, you'll be shocked to know. So I don't really know exactly where this comes from beyond, as we talked about before in the conversation with Greg, there is a position amongst many in the global far right of profound, deep admiration for Israel. The last 3 years have not changed that admiration. In fact, they admire them even more. Even more. The violence, the death, the destruction, it's actually made them admire Israel even deeper. And I think that Reinhardt probably thinks that she'd love, she's had lots of free space in the country, putting aside the fact that, how about indigenous rights, which of course, I'm sure she thinks is a wokish to even mention. Doesn't seem that irrelevant to me. That she, I think, would love the idea of Australia being that testing ground for Israel. I think she sees it that way. And people like that have said for a long time, by the way, that Australia should massively increase the amount of money we're spending on defence. The Albanese government is already spending an insane amount of money on defence, not least the bizarre and totally pointless AUKUS. But they want to spend far more of that, as in people like Gina Reinhardt. So I would guess, I don't think it was a brain fart. I don't think she just sort of thought about it at the moment. This was a, inverted commas, well thought out idea. But I've seen no reporting to discover where did this come from? Where's this idea coming from? And barely any media reported it in the first place. So, yes, I was alert and alarmed.
Okay.
Greg, what did you make of that announcement?
Gina Reinhardt is the sort of person who would think that white South Africans are being persecuted.
Indeed.
Say no more. I mean, honestly, hideous, vile statements that emanate from Gina Reinhardt are unfortunately the price we pay for freedom of speech. Dare I say it?
Yes.
We've got a question and comment for you, Antony, from Alison and Michael. It says, thank you for holding this really valuable webinar. It may seem strange to ask Antony about this given the terrible treatment he and his family have received from some parts of the Australian Jewish community. I have a number of Jewish friends and colleagues with whom I have had cordial relations for years, but I find myself at odds with several of them over the devastation in Gaza. I feel inhibited with communicating with them, so I was wondering whether Antony has any advice with regard to how to approach these friends with respect, but in a way that questions their stance on Israel's position at this time.
Look, I thank them both for that question. It is hard. I have said for a long time, especially since October 7, but before, that there has been a moral collapse in the heart of mainstream Jewish communities around the world around the issue of Palestine. And what I mean by that is the ability or the willingness to defend, support, fund at times the most egregious, horrible abuses. You have events, and some people will be aware in Australia, in synagogues regularly, not all, but some, praying for the safety of the IDF. There is a desperate need for a moral reckoning. Now, that is difficult if you have those views and you're trying to reach out to fellow Jews or Jewish people who are either very blindly in support of Israel or feel like any criticism is anti-Semitism. I guess my advice often to people is don't go in too hard because that's likely to turn them off. Maybe send them some writings which aren't necessarily far left material talking about the abolishing of Israel, but something which is maybe, and there are within Israel itself, by the way, not least in Haaretz, the so-called liberal newspaper there, critical writings which are still even quite liberal Zionists, not a view that I have, but liberal Zionists who are critical of what's going on. And because ultimately, I think when I say this to many Jewish people who write to me all the time, who are angst-ridden about themselves, about their kids, about their families, they can't talk to each other, they've lost friends, family, is none of this is making Jews safer. If you don't care about anything else, which you should, but if you don't, what Israel is doing in Gaza, the West Bank and elsewhere, I just came back from Israel and the West Bank just a few weeks ago for a reporting trip, and no one sane thinks that what Israel is doing in the West Bank, and again, I couldn't get into Gaza, but I got as close as I could, no one sane thinks that that has made Israel or Jews safer. No one thinks that. No one. Virtually every expert in the world says the exact opposite. So if you, as a Jewish person, feel uncomfortable expressing criticism of Israel publicly because you worry it gives support or ammunition to anti-Semites, I would say send people some material that is critical but not too critical, as almost like as a gateway drug, just to make people aware that there are different voices that are not looking to abolish all Jews or abolish Israel, but are trying to bring awareness to the complete catastrophe that is going on in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, beyond words, what is going on there. And that's a choice. It's a choice that Israel and many of its global supporters are making. And it's making all of us more unsafe.
Thank you, Antony. We have just one from our Zoom user, and Greg, I'd be interested to get your thoughts as well. This person says, Chris Hedges, an American, says, if you think the immigration detention camps being built along highways are for immigrants alone, you are naive. Surely you see this surveillance race coming for civilians in Western countries also, Antony.
Yeah, I've seen Chris talk about that, and what he's really talking about is that the US and other Western states start imprisoning dissidents and others, or just citizens who don't toe the line, I guess, or are incredibly critical. But it is something that worries me, and I would say what we've been talking about tonight is the first step of that. If you start prosecuting people holding a sign that says, I support Palestine action, or someone in Brisbane being charged with an alleged offence for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now that person's not going to go to jail for 50 years, but that is the start going down that road. And then the question really is, well, in whose service is that being done for? Is that being done to protect the state? Is it being done to protect Israel? Is it being done to protect the pro-Israel lobby? Who is it being done for in those cases? So do I worry that's where it's going? The case I mentioned before, I think those 6 or 7 Americans who are now going to be spending, well, the rest of their lives, unless they get pardoned by a future president, 50 to 100 years in American prisons, often longer than people who literally committed murder. And I fear that is the beginning of that. And that's obviously what the Trump administration wants to do. It's got 2.5 years left of its term. I fear after the midterms, not that it hasn't been gloves off before, it'll be even more gloves off, both internally and globally, because there's no election coming. I mean, obviously the Republicans, I guess, will want to win in 28. But yeah, I worry a lot.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Anthony's saying, that I'm not old enough to remember it, but friends of mine, particularly a couple of good lawyer friends of mine who were involved in the anti-Vietnam War demos, said, look, people used to get arrested, but, because the police used to beat them up and then they'd fight back. But, he said, we used to say all sorts of things about soldiers and about the South Vietnamese. And, no coppers were running around arresting us because of placards. That's how dangerous and insidious this is.
Yes.
And it's a special, what it's doing is singling out people. Aboriginal Australians put up with racism and abuse on a daily basis, both institutional and within the community. Well, I don't see any special laws being created for them. And that is the danger, that you create this sort of enclave of laws, but really only at the behest of one group in the community.
Which, by the way, sorry, can I say, which, by the way, often can lead, in my view, to increased anti-Semitism. Because I think the wider community is seeing that so many of the campaigns by the pro-Israel lobby to silence people, bully people, cancel people, pushed obviously by often the Murdoch press, but others as well. I don't see how that doesn't lead many people, to in fact increasing their dislike for Jews, which does worry me a lot.
Well, Richard Ackland, the journalist, has made the point, not in any gleeful way, but it's the point that Anthony picked up earlier, that the rise in anti-Semitism in Australia happened as a result of what happened post-October 7th. That is not to excuse it.
Absolutely.
But these things are generally causative. I think we've got time probably for one more, Nevena, have we?
Yes, we do. With plenty more questions coming in, but I'll just synthesize this one. And it's going off the back of what you were just saying, Greg. We've seen former Attorney General Mark Dreyfus signal about an increase to hate speech laws and speech suppression in Australia. Why do you think he's gone to the press about this? And do you think that is, in fact, going to lead to that clamping down? Now, Greg, I might start with you.
Well, Mark Dreyfus was a useless Attorney General. I don't think he's got any real credibility on this issue, and he did not at any stage as Attorney General push a Bill of Rights. So he's a backbencher, and he's entitled to his views, but he's a backbencher.
Well, I would just say I would agree with all that, and to say that I fear that it would potentially fit into what the government might do at the end of the Royal Commission. Not because Mark Dreyfus says it, particularly, as you say, he's a backbencher now. With maybe how much power he has within the Labor Party these days, I'm not quite sure. He was dumped as Attorney General, so I don't know exactly all the Labor machinations these days internally. But I fear that there will be, the government will want to probably implement all the recommendations from the Royal Commission, if not all, most. I don't know what they're going to be yet, of course. And some of them almost certainly, probably, will be desires to restrict certain speech around Israel, around Palestine, around Jews, around Judaism. And as Greg rightly says, there are many groups in society who are aggrieved and who suffer discrimination. Yes, some Jews do, many Muslims do. There are far more Muslims than Jews, by the way. Indigenous population, minorities, etc. And there's not really, I think, a great deal of understanding that if there is, as I saw literally this week, there was a conversation, I think it was, Steve Lowy, Frank Lowy's son, who gave to me this week, who basically calls for a special police unit just for Jews.
Yeah.
You're thinking, hang on a second.
Epitome of establishment journalism, Peter Harcher giving it a big, spread today.
Yes, we call Peter Harcher the desk general. I don't know if everyone knows it. Remember a few years ago,
there was a story. He's loved by Paul Keating, and I'm with Paul.
Yeah.
Nevena, have we got time? Maybe just, I know people have got to go, but just a very quick question, then we can wrap it up.
Absolutely. One more, Les. Yeah, sorry. I thought you had a question, Greg. Let's have a look. There's a lot of thanks coming in, Antony. There's plenty of excellent feedback. Greg, there was just this one that you might want. Can you please explain how we can have a Royal Commission prior to conducting a criminal trial? I think this is with regards to Bondi, if there's a quick answer to that.
That's a good point, and the answer is, I'm not a great fan of royal commissions, and I think if you do have, I mean, it's staying away from the criminal proceedings, but I think it raises interesting issues about what influence it has on the criminal proceedings. But it's a broader discussion about the influence of media and other agencies. But good question. So we'll wrap it up there, Antony. I just want to thank you. I mean, it's a great honour to have you, and we use that phrase, but it is because
Thanks, Greg.
your work is so extraordinary, and it's great to have you supporting the Information Rights Project, which our chair Gabriel Shipton established after the Assange campaign. Nevena, thank you for your great work once again, and I think that I've done my duties, and everybody can go off and have a glass of wine.
Or not.
We'll raise that glass to you, Greg.
Or not. No, thank you so much for having me, and it's been really an honour. And I'm seeing some of the thanks, so I want to thank people for engaging. And yeah, I think more people than ever engage on not just on Palestine, but these issues. I think more than ever.
Yeah.
So that's something. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone,
Antony.
and good night.
Thank you, Nevena.
Good night.